masks. They aren't what I'd call fun. They can get all gross and sweaty, they start to hurt after a while, and maybe worst of all, they're rarely fashionable.
Oh yeah.
I said rarely, not never. But say what you will about them, they're effective. Studies show that masking on its own can help lower infection rates, which in turn keeps you from catching or, dying from the Rona. If I can protect myself that well with just this little piece of cloth on my face, sign me up. And once we had a good grasp on how simply effective these little guys were, public health bodies across the nation started to suggest or implement mask mandates. Which, to some people, is an unforgivable sin. The backlash to preventative measures has been expectedly fierce since the jump, but it's getting a bit more aggressive lately. And I understand that a lot of Americans with our built-in ethos surrounding more freedoms are tempted to embrace a lack of preventative measures under the guise of protecting freedom. But in actuality, not having preventative measures to stop the spread of the Rona is actually a bigger blow to individual liberty than the preventative measures themselves. And if that sounds confusing, let me explain. There are many refined definitions of liberty out there, but most are wordy and boring, so let me make my own. Individual liberty is my right to do things, or in other words, my right to not have people tell me what I can and can't do. In the American sense of the word, individual liberty could be described as one's God-given right to have a McRocket launcher attached to their ATV that they ride around their private property. The less licenses involved, the more liberty it is, and the happier you make old Ronald McDonald. While the examples I use could be considered silly, I think there's obvious value in individual liberty. Marriage is the perfect example. I don't want the state or any other form of authority to dictate which consenting adults you can or can't marry, or how many you marry for that matter. That might be controversial, I'm not really sure the partisan politics of polygamy. Oh well, sue me, assholes. So before anyone tries to misinterpret my arguments, let it be known across the lands that I indubitably love individual freedoms, you see? However, and this part of the equation doesn't get talked about enough, an essential principle of a freedom-loving society is boundaries. If folks could walk around and kill anybody they'd like and hide behind the defense, I'm just embracing my individual liberty, dude. If you try to stop me, well, you're a tyrant. Would that society be healthy? Would you want to live there? Though technically that would be an individual unbound from government interference, living as they freely desire. I hope we can recognize that that place would be awful to live in. So if we want to have a meaningfully free society, there have to be some limitations. But unfortunately, the problem is that the line between a efficiently free society and a chaotic one can be hard to pin down. Some American states are perfect examples of how difficult reaching a consistent conclusion ends up being. Why, in Georgia, can I smoke inside, but at the same time I can't drive without a seatbelt? Why is it that in New Hampshire, I can drive without a seatbelt, but I can't smoke inside a restaurant? As we can see, each of these states, which I'm sure would hype themselves up to be a place of individual freedom lovers, come to vastly different conclusions about where the line should be drawn. To me, this confusion speaks to a muddled and faulty premise from which many Americans approach liberty. So, let's ask, is America's understanding of individual liberty correct? Is it possible that in our approach to preserving individual liberty, we're actually moving towards a society that actively stomps on them? To find an answer, let's look at examples of individual liberty out in the wild, starting with drunk drivers. After a few disastrous years, we learned prohibition doesn't work. Americans want their natty lights, and it's their God-given right to have one, damn it! Despite its many dangers, we agreed that it's up to each of us individually to decide if alcohol's our vibe. However, we've also come to recognize that if you drive a car while drunk, well, that's a different story. But let's really stop for a second and ask, why is it different? How come what's legal in my home suddenly becomes illegal when I'm driving? With an overly American definition of liberty, one could argue drunk driving laws violate individual freedom.
I keep trying to tell y'all, I know my body, the government doesn't. Who the hell's the nanny state to try to tell me how much intoxication is too much for me to handle? They don't see how I drive when I'm drunk. You know, my body is my responsibility, and that should be it. You know, and any attempt to infringe on that boundary is frightening overreach that we should resist at every turn, you know? By the way, a lot of y'all have been asking if I've been divorced, 5 times actually. Don't know why you keep asking me that.
Silly costume and silly dialect aside, I hope it doesn't seem like I'm trying to strawman this point. I want to confront it in good faith, as I do think it's obviously important to confront and talk about the different ways the state can oppress people. But I will remind you, we're talking about drunk driving here. But regardless of the good faith I want to approach this argument in, I think it's incredibly wrong-headed. And it's not because having drunk drivers on the road is unsafe. Well, I mean, to be clear, it is unsafe, but if you say that driving laws are good because they increase safety, a libertarian will jump out of the nearest bush to yell at you and tell you that government isn't here to make us safe. And we could go down that rabbit hole if we'd like. We could discuss if government should make us safe with this bush-dwelling libertarian, but that would be buying into their faulty framing of the conversation. And discussing if government should exist to increase safety doesn't really get to the core of why this pro-drunk driving stance is so profoundly wrong. It's wrong because the total abolition of drunk driving laws would actually make us less free. It's wrong because for all the time spent talking about someone's freedom to drunk drive, we ignore the fact that everyone else on the road has freedom too. When Americans talk about "my freedoms," a lot of us forget that everyone has their freedoms. The person committing the morally questionable act isn't the only one who has freedom, so do all the people their act impacts. Everyone a person under the influence drives by is another individual with an equal right to their own freedoms as the driver. All of them have a life and a family that said drunk driver could rip the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness from. With this framework to understand freedom, we see that drunk driving laws actually defend people's freedoms, because a drunk driver is essentially operating a giant individual liberty killer. And sure, a drunk driver might not injure anyone, but they aren't any less threatening to people's individual freedoms just because injury isn't a guarantee. Intoxication messes with your motor skills, making you more likely to cause a violent altercation, and that leap in likelihood is dangerous enough to be curbed. Through this lens, we can see that the sort of absolutist libertarian framework that might have somebody arguing drunk driving laws are an infringement to freedoms, they're essentially arguing that their right to endanger those around them outweighs everyone else's right to not be endangered. And if we let that understanding of freedom guide public policy, we'd be creating a society that values somebody's desire to drive drunk more than it values human life, liberty, or our pursuit of happiness. And that doesn't sound like a free country to me. And we could say the same about other driving laws. Are seatbelt laws an affront to individual freedom? Well, sure, in a hyper-libertarian sense, but catapulting through your windshield and killing other people because you're too masculine to wear a seatbelt is a worse affront to somebody's freedom to be alive. Are speed limits an affront to individual freedom? Should the driver be able to decide for themselves how fast is safe? In an ultra-libertarian society, sure, but that society would have a lot more preventable deaths from speeding accidents, and each of those deaths is an affront to that person's freedom to continue breathing. The response to those calling driving laws anti-freedom isn't to argue that driving laws don't roll back freedom, because technically they do. Rather, if we're trying to create the most free-loving society, the argument should be that a lawless roadway creates far more opportunities to roll back the freedom of a lot more people. And if we want a free society, we have to protect freedom. Great, cool, sound logic, let's move on. I initially had a section here trying to argue that driver's licenses help make roads a more freedom-loving place, but I think in hindsight, discussions of licenses are a bit tangential to this topic. The conversation becomes much more about how you structure your tests and if it's ethical to make somebody pay for a license, more so than just discussing if a barometer for skill as a vague concept helps protect freedom. So instead of record that section, I want to play the clip that bookended it, as I feel it's a good sense of what a world would look like governed by the folks who think seatbelt laws are tyrannical.
Should someone have to have a government-issued license to drive a car?
Hell no!
What's next? Requiring a license to make toast in your own damn toaster?
The license to drive? You know, I'd like to see some competency exhibited by people before they drive.
Gary Johnson getting booed at this libertarian presidential debate is exactly why this American ma-freedoms tradition is so worrying. The basic concept of a governing body doing things to make roads safe is so abhorrent to this room of LARPing freedom lovers that they boo one of the more successful politicians their party's ever had. I'd say you hate to see it, but I don't hate to see it actually. I love this clip more than I love myself. It pumps the happy chemicals in my brain like no other. I hope these examples I've outlined illustrate that our American approach to liberty is often selfish. It ignores the fact that other people have liberty too, and that your actions may be infringing upon theirs. And when enough people's freedoms are impacted by the actions of an individual, we call that an affront to public safety? While taking this long to build up to that definition may seem drawn out, which it is, it felt important to define public safety through the lens of protecting individual liberties, as it's often communicated through vague terms, which people then use to strawman arguments to compare the measures to history's worst dictators. Like saying public safety is for the greater good is weird and wishy-washy and just gives libertarians a lazy argument out. Rather, it should be said that public safety is the means through which we, as a society, take steps to ensure preventable disasters don't rip freedom-loving citizens of their liberties. With that understanding of freedom in mind, we return to our dear lover, Miss Rona. Masks, the obnoxious little gremlins that opened this video. In short, they're imperfect. Masks don't protect you from the Rona, but despite what some folks may have you believe, health experts don't claim they do. They just claim that masks help fight its spread, in the same way that these toothpicks don't claim to cure gingivitis, just that they help fight it. But we're not here to ask if masks are helpful. We're here to ask, do mask mandates protect freedom? Oh my god, yes, it's so obvious, guys. Like the dynamics we've discussed so far, the question can't just be, does this thing restrict one person's freedom? Because the answer to most every aspect of living in society is that it restricts the purest approach to freedom. Like, being made to wear clothes in public is an affront to somebody's freedom in the most ultra-libertarian sense of the word. Rather, if we want to seriously cultivate a freedom-loving society, the question has to be, does going off of the most Wild West, ultra-libertarian definition of freedom lead to other people losing their freedoms in this case? Put in terms relevant to our moment, if we let people enter businesses unmasked during a pandemic, are we actually going to cultivate the further spread of a disease, which will in turn rob more people of their individual freedoms? And the answer to that question is yes. Look, masks aren't perfect, but they are effective at stopping the spread. If you shove 2,000 people into a music venue, the devious Rona particles have a lower chance to spread if everyone is masked. So if you make sure folks wear a mask and provide one if they forget, you're doing your part to protect the freedom of your concert goers, as well as their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Well, on top of that, you'd be protecting the freedoms of the workers at the venue, but Americans are much more likely to sympathize with consumers than workers, so for those reasons, I am firmly pro-mask mandates. They're a relatively non-invasive safety measure, and masks are shockingly effective for how simple a device they are. Whether your mask is surgical, N95, or has your favorite anime character on it, mandates that make sure you wear a mask indoors ultimately make society a freer place to live, specifically by limiting the chance of exposure from citizen to citizen, therefore ensuring that more of us are free to pursue our own individual liberties and pursue our own happiness. But mask mandates are only one part of the conversation about stopping the spread of the Rona. So to finish off this discussion of freedom, let's move on to talking about vaccine mandates. Okay, folks, segues are hard, so what you just watched has either been in script form or in rough video form, ready for about 5 months, and the only reason I haven't yet, until now, pushed to finish and release this video comes in the part of the conversation that I just abruptly cut off. Sorry for that cliffhanger there. When it comes to the mask mandate part of the conversation, I felt pretty confident about my moral approach for a while now. You know, like I think it does make, to me at least, I'm making this video for a reason, a sort of intuitive sense that like, yeah, sure, you can make absolutely everything free to everyone's heart's content. And when it comes to personal stuff like beer, makes sense that you can have a beer if you'd like, even if it's dangerous. Makes sense that you can have spicy food if you'd like, even if that's dangerous. But when it comes to things that impact others because you have the potential to intrude on their freedom, you know, it's a bit of a different conversation. And, you know, I think the conversation then becomes like, how big of an ask is it to wear a seatbelt or wear a mask? Oh, it's not very? Cool, that's fine. Then I don't think that's a super huge abridgment of one's freedom, and it has an effective end that saves lives and protects freedom. So, you know, I've been pretty confident on that being a quality conclusion for a while. But when it comes to the vaccine mandate part of the conversation, quite frankly, and I think it's important for creators to be vulnerable and admit that, you know, like, I am a person who is learning. In fact, when it comes to this part of the conversation, I'm a novice who's learning, you know, so various versions of the script go back and forth on little details here and there because it's just such a complicated issue. Because unlike masks, which are, if I had one around me, I'd use it for a prop. You know, it's a little piece of cloth in front of your face. Seatbelt, it's a thing you put across your chest. Simple stuff, non-intrusive. But once you get into the conversations of vaccines and you run, you know, the risk of side effects and you have, you know, all that stuff is just a complexity to the conversation that I don't feel yet comfortable to discuss, or at least I don't have a conclusion is I guess what I mean. I'm still here learning, thinking through this conversation on my own. And while that's interesting for my personhood, it is less interesting for a video. You know, versions of the video that I think would be true to myself would be pretty meandery, and I just like having more conclusive, thought out videos with an endpoint in mind. Obviously, if you want to see a video like that, let me know in the comments down below. This is still a topic that interests me. I'm not fully abandoning the vaccine part here. It is just that rather than wait another 5 months for me to get my act together and come to a conclusion, I just figured I would finish this part up, record, you know, this outro here, release the video, get the feedback I need, let you folks in on a part of the conversation that I've been feeling pretty proud about for a while now. And then we'll see if anything comes of the other part of this 25-page script I've written. So, with that out of the way, thank you for watching this video, folks. I really, really appreciate it. Let me know in the comments down below what you think. If you've heard any different arguments for mask mandates, if there are things in the video you disagree with, any of that, let me know. All of it feeds the algorithm. That's what I care about. Such a charlatan. Anyways, let's turn it on over to the pre-recorded outro. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to toss me a like and subscribe down below. But if you really want to help me out, you can join me over on Patreon. Patrons get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, like early versions of every video, and exclusive Patreon-only videos. Plus, if you join the Piley Benton's Biggest Boys tier, you get your name read off at the end of every video. Zoth, Revo Pregame, Emily, Kyle Foley, Jennifer Jones, Caffeine Unicorn, Goblin of the Year, and Cameron Fordo. So if you want to hear your lovely name read off at the end of every video, be sure to join me on this specific tier. Thanks much, everyone, and I'll see you next time.